Hello everyone, today we are going to cover data access APIs provided by Spring Framework. Objectives of today's class which we are going to cover is understanding a JDBC template, understanding Spring named parameter JDBC template, SQL parameter source utils, batch prepared statement setter, and Spring integration with Hibernate. So more of data access APIs provided by Spring Framework we'll be covering. So the idea behind the templating frameworks or using templating engine is that providing you the handles or an interface, or maybe in the more technical form or a development level, I would say giving you one Java class object so that you can access all the methods from that class. That should be a template class or template, and rest of the functionality is abstracted from the developer. Different templating classes provided by Spring to handle different frameworks in Spring. So for an example, if you have to integrate Hibernate with your Spring application, so Spring provide you one templating class, though Spring has so many API classes, but it will give you one Hibernate template class which will give you almost all the functionality or method access so that you can manipulate your databases. Apart from that, there are many other templating classes provided by Spring for different other frameworks or tools like IBITIS, MyBITIS, Hibernate, the access of JDBC template. For big data things, there is a template. For social media, we have a template for all social media players like Twitter template, Facebook template, LinkedIn template. So they have almost integrational template for all the third-party tools and frameworks. So using that template, you can access the structure of others frameworks or APIs. So that is how Spring templates works. Now how to use using the templates. Classes that hide all the complex structure of classes and provide a simplified interface to the user without worrying about the underlying complexity. Spring's JDBC framework will clean up your JDBC code by shouldering the burden of your resource management and exception handling. Which means, if you guys remember, we discussed what all code we need to write to access any database through JDBC, right? From providing, using class.forName, registering a driver, providing the database credentials, then creating a connections, reading a connection, then prepared statement, result set, and all those kind of transactions, and at the end making sure that all the resources are closed properly. So these are the steps we need to perform if we are not using any templating frameworks or engine or a API. So Spring JDBC template or JDBC frameworks abstracted all these things and give you one template class. Using that you can simply access your or manipulate your databases. So that is how Spring JDBC framework works. So this functionality leaves you free to write only the code necessary to move data to and from the database without worrying about the exception handling, transactions, and all multiple other things which can be easily done by the APIs provided by Spring. Now, using templates. Spring comes with several data access templates, as I said earlier, each suitable for a different persistence mechanism. So for an example, starting with JDBC templates, which is used to create a JDBC connections. Then we have named parameter JDBC templates, which support the named parameter convention for JDBC connection. Then we have simple JDBC templates, which uses Java 5 constructs, again providing the same functionality with a different flavor. Then we have two versions of templates as per the Hibernate you are using. If you are using Hibernate 3 and above, then you can use Hibernate 3.Hibernate template. Using this class, you can access all the methods of Hibernate, which is Spring API class. Similarly, for IBITIS ORM, we have IBITIS SQL Map client template, which provides you or gives you the hook and the interface together for IBITIS ORM. Similarly, we have JDO and JPA template if anyone is working with data objects or JPA, Java Persistence APIs. So in that cases, we can use JDO and JPA. Using JDBC template. So before using JDBC template, we need to make sure that we have a certain database, and for that database, we should have Java to database connector, typically a jar file. In the case of MySQL, we'll use MySQL connector Java jar file, and for the connection pooling, we'll be using Apache Commons library for Commons DBCP, database connection pooling. So the data source encapsulate the database provider information and hence act like a connection factory by fetching the connections to talk to the database. It should be created by driver information such as user name, URL, password and other information. So if you are using Maven, you can simply add these two scripts or two dependencies and you are good to go with the database connections. So using Commons DBCP and MySQL connector jar. Now, before we work with JDBC template, we must set the data source first. So we have to create a data source object first, which further we need to inject in Spring JDBC APIs. So the following configuration shows how to set up a data source for MySQL. So configuring JDBC template. So in the previous slide, if you say we have created data source object here, and then by loading the data source beans XML, which is working like Spring Beans file, we are loading that file, and then further we are getting the data source bean out of that application context, and then further injecting that data source bean into the JDBC template constructor. This way we can get an object of JDBC template, and now when we have a JDBC template object, we have the full access of a database to execute any kind of queries. It can be DDL, it can be DML, both. Configuring JDBC templates. The steps are very simple. We need to treat all these things as a Spring Beans, like we have created data source that is created in the form of a Spring Bean. Similarly, we can also create the JDBC template in the form of a Spring Bean, and we can inject the data source directly into the XML file as well. Now, using JDBC templates. So working with JDBC templates is a class which provides more than 100 methods in it, using which you can query the database. You can execute any kind of a queries, whether it is a DDL or DML. You can create a schema, you can create table, drop table, create view, drop view, all these kind of things. You can alter table, you can select query, you can update, you can do insert. All these kind of operations you can handle with one single object, that is JDBC template. So that is the easiness Spring JDBC API provides us. So before moving forward, let me show you something. So I'm going to create another project from scratch. So let's add the required dependencies. So let's starting with the core part, the bean part, the context part, JDBC. So let me change that. I guess I need JDBC 3.3 if it is possible. I guess MySQL connector. Let me check. And Commons DBCP. Commons DBCP jar. This and MySQL connector. So I'm copy pasting this dependency here. So I have all the required dependencies now. Core, beans, context, JDBC, DBCP, MySQL connector jar. Now what I next to do, I need to create a configuration files, right? Spring configuration file. Let's say application context.xml beans next finish. So I have this file. Let's now let's add some context. Then maybe I need to add context property placeholder, and then location. I'll say jdbc.properties, and then I need to create JDBC properties here. Properties file, properties. Here I'm just going to copy paste the information I have already somewhere, maybe from this place. So I'll copy paste it here. Demo 18 September. Yes. So I have JDBC properties here. Second thing I need to do, I have Spring project created, JDBC properties defined. I need to define data source bean, and that bean I'll say ID data source class. I guess class should be org.commons DBCP. It's org Apache commons DBCP data source. I'm maybe missing something. Commons DBCP basic data source, right? Basic data source. Driver manager data source. Let me open that. I must be having the source code of it. Driver manager data source, that is Spring Framework JDBC. Let's open it. It's extending abstract driver manager data source, which is again Spring Framework, which is extending abstract data source. At the end of the hierarchy, you will see that everyone is implementing this data source, which is JavaX. So that is ending at data source, that is JavaX. Now let me show you this basic data source. This basic data source is directly implementing data source. So again, sometimes there is no advantages, disadvantages that, but since Apache, it's a Commons DBCP, basic data source is a part of Apache libraries. Some people says that it works with, Tomcat containers. It can gel with Tomcat container easily for connection pooling. You can easily maintain the connection through Tomcat connection management pool. So even JBoss use the Tomcat container. So it's easy for that. The same thing is provided by Spring as well. There is not much difference or advantages or disadvantages. You can use any of it. Now let's start with the property name. First thing, driver class name, value, or maybe let's copy paste it from here directly to save some time. So I have data source created. Now here is a catch. Catch is that if you want your data source related, database related Spring Beans should reside in some, specific XML and should not be part of normal classes. In that case, you can use some other file. Just for your information, how it worked when you worked in actual environment, this is how it should be handled. So then go ahead, enable context. So you have this data source with you here. Now what you need to do, rather than maintaining database related thing here, you simply go and copy paste it here. So you have data source. Data source config is common for anyone and every modules. Simply what you need to do, this way we can use the import thing as well, and you'll say that source -config.xml. So this way you can import data source config.xml here. And now I have data source configuration separated out, which has data source object created, JDBC template. This is first thing we are talking about, right? Then class. Let's see the JDBC template, org spring framework JDBC core, org spring framework .jdbc .core .jdbc template. Now in the JDBC template, what I need to do, we can provide property, we can say name, and we can inject data source. We can say ref insert data source. So if you see here, even I am importing it here in XML file, but it is giving me an option of data source which is part of your another XML configuration file. It is pointing directly. So simply add it and you have JDBC template ready to be used. We have injected data source here in JDBC template. Now I want to use JDBC template where and how should I inject it? I have objects ready. Spring APIs are ready to be used. I have data source. A data source is injected to JDBC template. Now I can access the database through JDBC template object. Maybe through constructor, maybe through properties, whatever you want. You can simply use it. Now, apart from that, I am also going to introduce here is one more thing. Context component scan. So what I am going to do, I'll put it at top of everything here and I'll say co.edureka package. So next part will be a package. Package can be co.edureka.do. In that I'll create one class. Let's say user DAO IMPL. Now I have DAO here. Remember, now I am going full annotation, no XML. XML will be there for the configurational part for these kind of things, component scan and all. Now I want annotations. Let's say annotation AutoAdd JDBC. You should use annotation repository, and in the annotation repository, whatever thing you mention here, it will be the bean. So let me see what all we have in the user class. Let's say first create a beans class user.java. Let's say I have a user.java or not. I guess I have. Do I have a getter setter string username? I'll create my own. So before moving to that, let's say I'm going to use this public list. If you guys, these queries are coming, return. This will be the object reference or object name if you want to use it somewhere else. This is how you will get through Spring context. So qualifier is used with ambiguity to resolve the dependencies, not while defining it. Here we are defining it, how to access it. If we have two kind of a JDBC template here, let's say JDBC template 1, JDBC template 2. in XML file. If we have JDBC template 1 and 2, in that case I need to use AutoWire and qualifier together to identify which JDBC template I need to pick. So if you guys see here, I have JDBC template object here. I just want to show you what all methods we have, then we'll see how we proceed. So if you see JDBC template dot, as soon as I do this, you can see the list of methods. So many methods, right? So one object and you can do whatever you want with your database. From batch updates to execute queries, any kind of a queries, any kind of a statements, DDLs, DMLs, getting data source again, getting the results or executing the query for object, query for map, query for list, all these kind of things you can do. So for an example, if you say add a string query is equal to select star from user and say query for list, and you can simply return this list of map, not this, use map, it says string, and then you can use it here. Let's be specific. So that's what I was trying to explain, that we have so many methods inside JDBC template which can be used for accessing the database. So for querying for single and multiple rows, the overloaded query methods are used to fetch data from the databases. Few of the overloaded query methods that convert your column value to an appropriate data type, like query for int or query for object, query for list, query for map, and query for row set. So these are different methods we have for different kind of object to be returned. So for an example, query for int accepts SQL query to be executed and returns an integer value. So for example, count of the rows. So in that case, you can pass that query inside the JDBC template, query for int, and you can get the desired return from the database. Similarly, we have a query for map which returns a single row in the form of map, which is a string and object, and that map is in the form of a string and object. String or key will be your column name and object will be the value of column. So this way it will come in the form of name and value pair, and it will be returned to your calling method. Apart from that, we have query for list, which is one step ahead of the map, which returns query for map is written one single row. But if you want multiple rows to be returned by your SQL query, in that case we should use JDBC template.query for list, which returns list of map. This way you will get the entire list, something like this, which I was telling you. So let's create one utility package here, maybe one class, not class, first package. So you say add application. So let's try to run it and see everything is working fine or not. Here you go. So we have the list of users here. So this way you can easily access your database. Now you guys can see here, with simple configurations, one single data source bean, one single template bean. That's it. You can write any number of DAO classes and you can use JDBC template directly. You can auto wire JDBC template in any DAO class and you can access your database. Little bit easier what we used to do earlier to access any database. You have any number of methods here and you can do that. So let's move and see what else we have. Now, using JDBC templates along with bind variables. So for an example, right now what we need to do here. So let's say if I have to, let's say return, let's say public void get user by ID, and you can say ID is, let's say, user ID, and then you are saying string query equal to select star from user, where let's say what is there, ID is equal to plus user ID, right? This way we need to execute query, and what you need to do, you just need to say system JDBC template dot query for map, and here you need just, so this way you just need to provide by get user by ID, and from the test method, you simply need to v.get user by id. Maybe I'll say 1. Do we have 1? Yes. So when you run this, you will get the user. So I'm using, do we have select user? So the exception was coming because I was using the wrong table name, users, and user only, S was missing. So that's why it was giving an exception. So that is the easiness or developer friendly API provided by Springs. That's why development is become easier for any kind of a developer, or I would say not increase, it will decrease the time to market for any product or a project. So that's why each and every client is, wants to use Spring to create a project, because it is the most complex things. The modules can be easily implemented by Spring without much hassle. Using JDBC templates, bind variables. Creating a dynamic query or a SQL query. Preferred options as opposed to using inline variable is bind variables. This will protect our application against SQL injection attacks. So apart from that, JDBC template API can help us with the use of bind variable to prevent any kind of a SQL injection attacks against your application. How to use it? Something like this. The same thing what I did here, I did get user by. If you use this, the API Gina is very vast. You can use or you can have whatever was there. The thing is that API is more advanced form. So the things which we have earlier as well, plus some new things as well being added here. So get user by ID via bind. So now I have string user ID, and instead of doing this, I'll say question mark. So what I say now, I'll say query for object. I'll pass new object in the form of array, and in that I'll pass user ID, which will be going to replace string.class, or maybe I guess hash map.class. It takes query parameter, it's take new object array. In that object array you can pass your parameters, that dynamic parameters. So why array? If you have let's say for example you are saying select star from user where id is equal to this, name is equal to this, and age is equal to this. So if you have multiple where clause, then you can have it comma separated here like this, and then name or something like this. Let's say same thing, run it, hopefully it should work. It's giving exception, and then I guess I can use this. Otherwise I need to modify my class here, method here, and I'll say so if you want that the complete set of row is written like username, password and everything, then we need to create a bean with the getter setter for these columns. Let's say ID, username, password enabled, something like this. So having then getter setters, and then in the DAO IMPL you need to say user.class. Okay, so lab is in between going on. So which of the followings can be eliminated by using JDBC template? Resource management, exception handling, elements repeated codes of JDBC API statements and calls, or D, all of the above. We don't need to do resource management, right? We are not doing resource management done by API. Exception handling, no, we are not doing it. See, elements repeated codes by of JDBC API statements and call. Are we using result set prepared statement connection again and again? Nowhere. It's D, right? Mapping rows to domain objects. So public employee get employee for ID, then employee ID and all, and then returning the employee mapper. Create your employee mapper class with the help of row mapper. Mapping rows to domain object. Now we'll see how to create an object from each row of the record. We can use row mapper interface that has one method, map row. where you need to map the incoming row to the domain object attributes. You can create the row mapper as an anonymous class, or you can have your own class implementing the row mapper interface separately. So this way you can create your own row mapper class, or can have an anonymous class where you are using it in your DAO class. So if you think that it is getting repeated in your application code, so the standard and the advice is that you create the row mapper for your own class and then further use it wherever you want, rather than creating an anonymous class here. So maybe let's see whether the example is here or not. Something like this, but I want to use the more smarter way of it. So if I have user class here, no. So this way, using row mapper, we can map the incoming rows with the domain object. Here domain object is your bean, that is user bean. So using row mapper, you can map the incoming rows to your bean, and you can further return the list of beans. So when you call this here, it is returning list of user bean, which you can iterate and you can access it. So this way we can map our tables row to the domain object, and we can return one single bean or a list of bean depending on the requirement. Now, apart from JDBC template dot query for object, query for integer, query for map, list, we have different other methods like JDBC template dot update or JDBC template dot execute. So JDBC template dot update can be used for multiple DML operations like insert, delete, and update. So if you have to insert employees, if you have to insert data, if you have to insert records, if you have to update records or delete records, then you can use JDBC template dot update method, which execute any of your DML statements, whether it is insert, delete, or update. And the return type is integer for this update method, which says that the number of rows being updated, inserted, or deleted as per your SQL statement. Similarly, we have dot execute method in JDBC template. So in JDBC template dot execute method, you can use DDL statements like create tables, drop tables, create schema, drop schema, create views, alter table, all these kind of things you can use under JDBC template dot execute method. So we have seen the examples already. So let's move. So named parameter JDBC templates, another form of JDBC template, or I would say another Java class provided by the Spring Framework API. It's use map. So the steps is we create the map with the provided arguments, setting them to the name key. Then we pass this map to the query. The names declared in the query must match the keys of our map. So for example, you are using map and you are setting key and value, and key is, let's say, name, age, or something. So name and age, the keys should be exactly match of your column name, otherwise it will give you an error. Using this, you can simply create a map of attributes for update or maybe for insert, and then you can further pass it and use it in your application. So named parameter JDBC template we can use by passing or using the parameters, like just providing the parameters with map and writing the queries. So let me check whether we have that options available in this as well. So let's say JDBC template dot update method, and then providing the objects arguments SQL parameter value. Can create number, let's say 1, value is, let's say, Edureka test. Name parameter JDBC template. For that we need to create another templating object, but it should be named parameter JDBC template, this one. So rather than using this, maybe let's park it for a while. When you have to use name parameter JDBC template, you simply can have multiple beans here as per your requirement. So for an example, right now I have a JDBC template, then you can have a named parameter JDBC template like this, and then you can say named param dot named parameter JDBC template object. In that case, it's saying that data source is not found. In that case, we need to use constructor org, and we need to say name data source ref data source. So named parameter JDBC template takes your constructor setter for it. So like normal JDBC template, you can use this as well. Simply go ahead, auto add named parameter JDBC template like this, and further you can access this way. Update user set name is equal to, in this case you can use update method, something like this, or even in that case you can use map SQL parameter source and multiple other options. Let's say query, rather than using this you can use map this way. You can use name parameter JDBC template. So in one context or in one XML file, we can use multiple templates together if we want, depending on the requirement. So with queries, does name parameter JDBC template not need to use row mapper, as the column names must match the map's key value? So this is for update and insert, where you can use map with the key value pair, where key is your column name, to using update method for insert, delete, or update SQL statements. JDBC batching. So before going to the JDBC batching provided by Spring, let's see what we had earlier. When we need to do multiple inserts or multiple updates into the database, how we used to do that in earlier days. Let's say if you have thousands of rows, hundreds of rows to insert, how we used to do that earlier. Earlier we also used to implement the batch updates using batch inserts and all, right? So if you remember that execute update method, so what it saves the back and forth cost from your application server to the database in the case of multiple updates. So if you have thousands and hundreds and thousands of rows to update or insert, we can use batch updates. So how to do that? We have a class in JDBC, Spring JDBC API, which is known as SQL parameter source utils. This is a utility class which create a batch for you. A batch can be in the form of list of domain objects or list of beans. Let's say employee beans, which takes that list of employees bean and convert it into the to array and create a SQL parameter source array in the form of parameters. Then using simple JDBC template .batch update method, you can insert multiple row into the database. So the JDBC statement will be reused when executing the batch instead of creating a new statements every time you execute a call to a database operation. So that is one thing. This method stop you creating a new statements every time for the batch. Another advantage is that the round trips to the database, usually over the network, which are drastically reduced. With 2 or 3 lines, you can remove the code which is not needed. Apart from that, you have removed 2 main performance bottlenecks, like which used to create new statements every time and the round trips with the help of SQL parameter source utils object. Another way of doing the same thing is that using batch prepared statement setter. This is an interface in Spring Framework API using which you can set the size of the batch and you can execute the statement in a loop for batch update. It works in the same way, but it is a different approach altogether. Rather than using SQL parameter source util, we can use this as well. But the difference here is that you need to write a little bit more code in compared to the earlier version. Let's see the example. Dependencies are same. Go to the context file. We have multiple templates here. JDBC templates, simple JDBC template, name parameter JDBC templates. You can have multiple templates you want in one single file, and you can use whichever you would like to use in your application. So if you see here in the course DAO, see the stock DAO. In the stock DAO, we are using batch prepared statement setter to insert list of stocks. Insert into stock, number, name, category, then the values. And using batch update method with batch prepared statement setter, we can execute the statement and persist the data into the database in the case of hundreds and more than 100 rows. So let's see the test one first. Let's add the stock. So let's see whether we have a, where is the stock table? Name is stock. Okay, select start from a stock. Okay, delete the stock. Make sure that it is empty. Now run the test class. What I am doing, I am inserting 20 rows using batch insert prepared statement setter. How we are doing it here? Simply using this method, I'll execute JDBC template batch update method, pass the SQL query, and using new batch prepared statement setter and this piece of code where I override the method set values. Set values and get batch size is a method which is in batch prepared statement setter interface, which we need to override. So let's run this and see 20 entries has been added into the stock table successfully. So if you see here, 20 entries being added with the help of batch prepared statement setter. Similarly, we have other way to do that as well with the help of batch insert by JDBC, name parameter JDBC template. So it's up to you to decide which one you would like to use. So what I am doing, insert into course ID title price. This is ID title price is equivalent of your table column name, and this ID title is the attributes of the bean, and this ID title price is the column name of your table. I'm using SQL parameter source utils to create a batch and then converting this into the courses.toArray, the list of course, and passing it to the create batch method. And using name parameter JDBC template batch update, I am inserting multiple row or the multiple courses into the table. So let's delete the course. So I am going to insert the course using by named parameter JDBC template. So 10 entries added into the course table successfully. So here we go. So this way we can use batch updates in two ways. One is with batch prepared statement setter. Another one is with named parameter JDBC template using SQL parameter source utils. So now it's up to you to decide which one you would like to use in the case of batch updates. So what we have learned so far with the help of Spring JDBC template APIs, with the help of JDBC client program or JDBC template, the boilerplate code, we remove the boilerplate code like handling of connections, statements, dealing with resource management and all those kind of things. These boilerplate code being reduced or separated out by the abstraction layer of Spring JDBC API. It's segregated. We get rid of these things without much hassle with the piece of configuration. And without worrying about those things, we just need to write business logic, actual business logic, which means querying to the database directly. In the case of normal queries, select, updates and inserts. With the help of prepared statement callback, callback handlers, callback statement call and many other things, we can simply write actual business logic and hide non-business code in templates, which allows the developer to concentrate on the business logic only. So this is how Spring JDBC API help us in developing a DAO layer for our application. ORM. So before going forward with the Hibernate, the intent of covering the Hibernate is there in the form of integration. Hibernate itself a big framework, and in Edureka we have a separate course for it for 8 weeks and 1 month. What we are going to cover is that how we can integrate Hibernate with Spring framework, how easy it's to implement or integrate Hibernate ORM. So Hibernate is an ORM frameworks, object relationship mapping framework. When we say object relationship mapping, is that the relational mapping is done through POJO and tables, POJO classes or domain object classes with the tables. Your Java class is directly mapped with your database table, that is ORM. In the ORM, SQL query is generated by ORM itself. So you don't need to write a SQL query for your application, which is hidden. Hibernate is developed on top of JDBC. It's not like that JDBC is not being exploited or not being used. It is being used, but it's being abstracted by Hibernate layer. Since Hibernate generates its own query, you don't need to write it. So DB specification is not required, which means you can easily switch to one database to other database if you are using Hibernate without worrying about the implementation part of it. Transaction management like commit and rollback are automatically taken care by the API. Apart from that, Hibernate also reduces the development time, and the line of code is much lesser in compared to the other approaches, because in this case you don't need to write a query. Difference between JDBC and Hibernate. In the JDBC, your SQL queries are database specific. So if you're using JDBC, if you want to change a database from one database to other database, you need to make sure that the query is written should be available or should work with the new database as well. Whereas Hibernate is database independent, making it easy to work with when we change database or when we migrate database from one to another. In the JDBC part, if we need caching mechanism, we need to implement our own caching mechanism if we are using Spring JDBC. Whereas Hibernate provides you 3 levels of caching mechanism. If you are using JDBC, then changing to a different database is painful, whereas in Hibernate, it is a single line of change in your configuration file. Developers have to write a lot of code to map between tables and Java objects in JDBC, because you need to write your own queries and code to do a mapping between your POJO and your tables. Whereas in Hibernates provide you efficient way to map your Java objects into database table with the help of configuration files and annotations in the newer version of Hibernate. So both has their own pros and cons, and we need to decide at design level which way to go, whether we use Spring IBTs, Spring Hibernate, Spring JDBC template or any other API for interacting with our RDBMS. So Hibernate works in between your Java and your database, or you would say that DAO layer in your database as an ORM which sit in between your database server and your application server. So first thing, you need to create a domain object or domain class for your mapping, which in this case is course, where you provide a course ID, name and price with the getter setter. Then your DAO looks more neat and clean in compared to Spring JDBC template. You can see yourself. You simply provide Hibernate template injection here, and if you have to insert a course, you will call method template.save. If you have to update a course, you can call simply template.update. If you need to delete a course, you need to simply call the method template.delete. It's more transparent, more easy, and code management and maintainability is easy. But again, deciding any ORM or JDBC API is call taken by usually your architects. It depends on what kind of a business you are going to support. So it's more of a bigger decision in compared to the framework. You need to decide first, then you can jump into the framework, at which framework I should use for the ORM layer or database layer. Then we should have one XML mapping file for Hibernate. It's known as course.hbm.xml, which map your POJO and your table. Here POJO is your course and table is courses, and you provide the column name and attributes of the course here. And this is the main configuration where we inject data source object into the session factory of Spring Hibernate API and provide the mapping resources, which can have one or many mapping resources. So in the session factory instance of Spring Hibernate API, you need to inject data source, then you need to inject mapping resources and provide Hibernate related properties where you can choose your dialect. Dialect is depend on your database. So for an example, in front of your screen, you can see we have mentioned Oracle 9i dialect, which says that database we are going to use is Oracle. But if the database is MySQL, Postgres or any other database, then we need to change the dialect. And this is the single line which we need to change or update in the case of migrating from one database to other database. Rest you don't need to do anything. And rest of the two properties is for auto update and showing SQL queries while executing your application into the log file. Like we used JDBC template in our previous API, we have Hibernate template as well provided by, this is the class which is provided by Hibernate integration API. So in this template, we need to inject the session factory object, which holds the user session or database session for you. Further, now we have a Hibernate template object created. This Hibernate template object can be used wherever we want. Okay, we can simply inject that object in the course DAO, user DAO or any other DAO class if we want. So simply we did this. Let me starting with the POM file for adding dependencies. So if you see the POM file here, we are using Spring APIs beans, core context beans JDBC, and then the connector commons DBCP, that is common what we have used so far. Now, since we are integrating Hibernate with Spring, then Spring ORM jar is necessary. This Spring ORM jar has the integration API for Spring and Hibernate integration. Remember that always. For Spring and Hibernate integration, we needs to implement or we needs to import one jar file known as Spring ORM, and the rest of the two jar file is related to Hibernate framework, Hibernate core and Hibernate entity manager. So let's see the configurations files first, starting with the application context file. So first thing, we have loaded JDBC properties file. Then we have defined data source, then session factory. This session factory is part of Spring ORM jar. That's why I was saying that it's quite necessary, this Spring ORM jar, because that is the integration point. So we need to first use local session factory bean. We need to inject the data source, then the mapping resources. In the mapping, resources can be your one XML or multiple list of XMLs. And your dialect, in the dialect, if you see, I am using MySQL dialect because I am using MySQL database. So let's see the course.hvm.xml, what we have here. In this course.hvm XML, we have course being mapped with table course with ID, title and price as a column name. So let's see the course first. Delete the course now. The course is empty. Coming back to the application context. This is for your primary key, unique key, which generates unique identifiers. In the case of unique key, if for an example, sometimes if you are aware of, if we have primary keys, then we use to generate primary keys itself. I mean, maybe some alphanumeric value or maybe some integer values, which is auto-generated and should not be passed by user. So in that cases, but that should be mapped with your database schema details as well, or your table definition as well. So if your table definitions ID column is auto-generated, then it will be generated automatically, otherwise not. You need to pass it. Now I have session factory object created. What I did, I created another template, this time Hibernate template. So this Hibernate template is part of Spring ORM jar again, where we inject the session factory object. Now I have Hibernate template object created, and I can inject or auto wire this Hibernate template wherever we want, whether it is in a course draw or any other class. We can either auto wire it or we can either inject it. So in the course draw, you will see that I am using Hibernate template, and using this I am simply calling save, update, delete and find, that is select. Now let's see how to run this. So I am going to save a new course, save course with the help of Bean. This will save this into the database Spring Hibernate. So here we go, one new course inserted successfully into the database. So let's see that. So if you guys see that, you will find using Hibernate it's little bit easier and more cleaner approach in compared to Spring JDBC template API. Hibernate is a very powerful framework, having said that, but it depends upon your requirement. If you have a requirement for Hibernate framework, then only use it. Okay, otherwise there is no need to use Hibernate just for the sake of it. So this is your where clause. So for an example, nowadays you guys know that is everywhere is big data, right? So much of data outside on the network, on the web, irregular, irrelevant, some relevant, some irrelevant data, needed, not needed, raw data, some trash data, some good data, right? So when you know the business you are going to support will have unstructured, more of a unstructured data sets you are going to deal with, then I would suggest not to use Hibernate. I would not use Hibernate. Rather than I will go for Spring JDBC API, JDBC template, or I would go for Spring IBTs. So very high level thing I am telling you. If you know that your database, I mean business you are going to support is quite structured, everything is structured, everything has relations. Let's say keys, primary keys, composite keys, everywhere is keys, and you have a related data. In that case, you should use Hibernate. Otherwise, you won't be able to utilize the full capability of Hibernate. For an example, I'll give you the example of some client or maybe some business as well. For an example, analytics. If you are playing around with analytics dashboard or analytics business, marketing business, where you need to crunch a lot of data, multiple joins with different joins with different tables, or reporting data, you have a reporting dashboard where you need to generate report from multiple tables by putting joins, complex data, right? In those cases, I would suggest you use IBTs, MyBTs, Spring JDBC template and all those kind of things. Lightweight APIs, not Hibernate. If you have very structured data, maybe telecom, maybe banking, finance, health, you know that everything is related, everything is structured, data should be structured, that is a requirement. In that cases you can go with Hibernate. So what does the property Hibernate dialect refers to? Transactions. Spring Framework provides excellent support for transactions. You can use annotations to achieve this goal or use the framework's AOP techniques. First, you need to annotate the respective class, usually your DAO or its method via the transactional annotation like this, on top of your class, on top of method. Then in your XML integration or XML configuration, you can wire your transaction manager bean. Spring provides different managers for various providers. Hibernate Transaction Manager for Hibernate, JPA Transaction Manager for JPA, and similarly for JDU. So what you need to do, you have to create a Hibernate Transaction Manager bean and then inject the session factory into it. And further, you can use that transaction manager wherever you want, like session factory or template. Let's see whether I have any new POM or new jar here. Jar is same, there is no new jar. Coming back to the configuration. In the configuration, you will see rest everything is fine, like session factory bean, then Hibernate Transaction Manager. This Hibernate Transaction Manager, I am injecting session factory here. Then further you can use Hibernate Transaction Manager wherever you want. Then we have %DAO, and here I have injected template and transaction manager. So if you see here, I have mentioned it as a repository, and apart from that I have mentioned the transactional as well, read only for %DAO. So further you can use Hibernate template to find it and save. So this will work for your transaction management. Let's see that person class. So this will execute it under one single transaction. If you open this, you will see 3 rows being inserted here. So the most complex thing in the database access and transactions, rollbacks, all those kind of manipulations becomes very easy if we use Spring together with Hibernate. So with the help of annotations and configurations, you can implement these things very easily. So there is a question from Annie. If our requirement is to fetch records based on various conditions, we usually use the underscore fill in the blanks clause in our SQL script. So it's a where clause. Another question is, Annie wants to use declarative transaction management approach. Which annotations will Annie have to use? Remember, declarative transaction management, which we have just seen. It's annotation transactional. You just need to put on top of your class if you want that class should be in transactional mode, executed in transactional mode, or any method. You just need to put annotation transactional. That's it. That method will be executed in the transactional mode. Thank you.